They sold her like she couldn't hear a thing. By sundown, she knew more about that town than any man who'd ever shouted in its streets. The auction yard sat under a hard, white sun, dust hanging in the air like it had nowhere else to go, and men leaned on the wooden rails with slow, easy cruelty, hats low, voices louder than they needed to be, because they believed some people didn't count enough to listen. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of it all, boots planted in dry earth that hadn't seen rain in weeks, watching as they brought her forward, wrists free but posture tight, like someone who had learned long ago that stillness could be safer than movement. "Deaf," the auctioneer said, tapping his own ear with a grin that drew a few chuckles from the crowd. "Don't speak neither. Not a word. Not a sound. Can't hear you if you tried." The laughter rolled out slow and mean, the kind that didn't need a reason, and the girl didn't look up, didn't flinch, didn't react at all, her eyes fixed somewhere just past the men, past the rails, past the noise itself, as if she had already stepped outside of it. Ethan watched the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides, not trembling, not weak, just aware, like she was counting something no one else could see. He had seen broken people before, seen fear, seen anger, seen that hollow look that meant someone had already given up. But this wasn't that. This was something quieter, something held back, like a breath that hadn't been released yet. "Start at $5, the auctioneer called, and a man near the front spat into the dirt, shook his head, muttered something about useless stock, and no one stepped forward. The silence stretched, not respectful, just empty, the kind that came when something had already been decided. Ethan moved before he thought about it, before the weight of it could settle in his chest, his voice cutting through the heat like a line drawn in dry sand. 20. Heads turned, slow at first, then sharper, eyes narrowing beneath brims, measuring him, questioning him, wondering if he'd lost his sense somewhere between his ranch and this yard. 20, the auctioneer repeated, surprised enough to forget his grin for half a second, and Ethan didn't look at him, didn't look at anyone, just kept his eyes on the girl, who still hadn't moved, still hadn't lifted her gaze. "That's right," he said, calm, steady, like he was naming the price of feed, not a life. A murmur ran through the crowd, low and restless, but no one countered, no one cared enough to challenge it, and the hammer came down with a dull crack that seemed louder than everything that had come before. Sold. The word hung there, heavy, final, and for the first time, the girl blinked, just once, slow and deliberate, her lashes catching the sunlight for a brief second before her gaze shifted, slightly, almost unnoticeably, toward Ethan, not fully meeting his eyes, not openly acknowledging him, but not missing him either. He felt it more than saw it, that shift, that quiet awareness, like the moment before a storm when the air changes and you can't explain why. He stepped forward, boots echoing against the wooden planks, reaching into his pocket for the folded bills, the transaction quick, simple, the way all complicated things like to disguise themselves out here. When he turned back, she was standing where they had left her, exactly the same, except now there was something else in the stillness, something sharper, something listening in a way no one else in that yard would ever understand. Ethan didn't say a word to her, didn't reach out, didn't try to guide her, just stepped down and started toward the open road beyond the rails, and after a heartbeat, she followed, her steps quiet in the dust, matching his pace without needing direction, without needing sound. Behind them, the laughter started up again, fading with distance, swallowed by the wide stretch of land ahead, and neither of them looked back, because some things, once left behind, didn't deserve the courtesy of a second glance. The road out of town stretched long and pale under the afternoon sun, the kind of road that made a man feel smaller with every step he took, and Ethan Cole walked it without looking back, his pace steady, boots pressing shallow prints into dust that would be gone by morning, while behind him the girl followed at a distance of 3 paces, not too close, not too far, like she understood the space a stranger needed before trust could even begin to take shape. The wind moved low across the open land, carrying the dry scent of sage and distant cattle, brushing against Ethan's coat and tugging lightly at the brim of his hat. But it was not the wind that made him slow his steps, it was the silence, the kind that felt different when shared, heavier somehow, like it had weight between 2 people who had not yet found a way to speak. He stopped once, just past a crooked fence post that leaned like it had given up years ago, and reached into his saddlebag for a canteen, taking a measured drink before extending it slightly behind him without turning around, an offering made without demand. And for a moment nothing happened, no movement, no sound, just the quiet stretching thin, until he felt the faintest shift in the air as she stepped closer, her fingers brushing the metal before taking it. Light, careful, controlled. She did not hesitate, did not fumble, did not search for the canteen the way someone without sound might. And Ethan noticed that, not with suspicion yet, but with the kind of attention a man learned from years of watching things that did not want to be seen. She drank, slow and even, then returned it the same way, placing it back into his hand with precision that did not match the story the town had told about her. And still she said nothing, still she made no sign that she expected anything in return. They continued on, the land opening wider with every mile, the town shrinking behind them until it became nothing more than a memory shaped like dust and noise. And by the time the sun began to lower, turning the sky into a dull burn of orange and gold, Ethan's ranch came into view, a modest stretch of land bordered by weathered fencing, a small house set against the horizon like it had grown out of the earth itself, quiet, isolated, untouched by the kind of voices that filled that auction yard. He led his horse through the gate, its hinges creaking in a long, tired complaint that carried across the yard, and for the first time, he glanced back at her, not fully, just enough to see if she had stopped, if she had hesitated, but she had not. She moved through the gate without pause, her eyes sweeping the space once, taking in the barn, the water trough, the lines of the fence, mapping it in a way that felt instinctive, not lost. Inside the house, the air was cooler, shaded from the dying sun, and Ethan set his hat down on the table before stepping aside, giving her space to enter first, a quiet gesture that said more than words would have, and she stepped in without fear, without confusion, her gaze adjusting quickly to the dimmer light, her movements smooth, measured. He pointed once, simple and clear, to a small room at the end of the hall, then to the table, then to the stove, gestures stripped down to their meaning, and she watched him, not blankly, not uncertain, but with a focus that suggested she understood more than she let on, then turned and walked to the room without needing him to repeat himself. Ethan stood there a moment longer than necessary, listening to the soft sound of the door closing, to the quiet settling of the house around them. And something in that silence shifted again, subtle, almost invisible, like the land before a storm, and though he could not yet name it, he felt it all the same, a sense that whatever he had brought home from that yard was not what the town had believed, and maybe not what he had believed either. Morning came slow over the ranch, lights spilling across the plains in long, pale streaks that turned dust into gold for just a few quiet minutes before the heat took it back, and Ethan Cole was already awake, standing at the small iron stove with a pan warming over a low flame, the faint crackle of wood the only sound inside the house. He moved without hurry, the rhythm of habit guiding his hands, measuring out coffee grounds, pouring water, letting the smell rise into the still air like something steady and reliable, something that did not change no matter what the world outside decided to do. He set a second cup on the table without thinking about it, then paused, just for a moment, as if catching himself in the act of expecting something, before turning back to the stove. The door at the end of the hall opened without a sound, not a creak, not a shift, just the quiet presence of movement, and she stepped into the room already dressed, already composed, her hair pulled back loosely, her expression the same calm surface he had seen the day before, but her eyes sharper now, taking in the room as if she had memorized it overnight. Ethan did not greet her with words, only a slight nod, then gestured toward the table, slow and deliberate, making sure the meaning was clear without needing sound, and she followed, her steps measured, her gaze flicking once toward the stove, then the cups, then back to him, not lost, not uncertain, just observing. He set the plate down in front of her, simple food, nothing fancy, and stepped back, giving her the space to choose, and she did, sitting without hesitation, her movements quiet but precise, her hand steady as she reached for the cup. The spoon resting inside it shifted slightly as she lifted it, making a soft, dull tap against the ceramic, a sound small enough that most men would never notice it, but Ethan did, And so did she, though she did not react, not outwardly, not in a way that could be pointed to or named, just a flicker in her eyes, quick and gone, like something acknowledged and dismissed all at once. He watched that, not staring, not pressing, just letting the moment settle into his mind the way a man stores away details he does not yet understand but knows he will need later. After they ate, he moved to the shelf near the door and picked up a small object, simple, worn from use, a brass bell no bigger than his palm, the kind a man might use to call for help across a quiet stretch of land where voices did not carry far. He walked back to the table and set it down in front of her, not sliding it, not forcing it into her space, just placing it there with the same care he used for everything else, then tapped it once with his finger, letting it ring out softly, a clear, bright sound that lingered for a second before fading into the room. He met her eyes then, holding her gaze just long enough to make sure she understood, his hand moving in a simple gesture. Ring it if you need something, no words, no pressure, just an offering. She looked at the bell, her expression unchanged, then reached out and touched it, not ringing it, not testing it, just resting her fingers against the cool metal as if weighing it, considering it, and for a brief second, her eyes lifted to his again, something unreadable passing through them, something deeper than confusion, deeper than gratitude, something closer to recognition. Then she withdrew her hand, leaving the bell exactly where it was, untouched, silent, and Ethan felt that same shift in the air again, subtle but certain, like the beginning of something he could not yet see, but could no longer ignore. The afternoon settled heavy over the ranch, heat pressing down like a hand that did not intend to move anytime soon, and Ethan Cole worked through it the way he always had, steady, quiet, letting routine carry him where thought might lead somewhere less certain. The fence line along the north end needed mending, one post leaning too far out of place, and he drove it back into the ground with measured strikes of his hammer, each hit sending a dull vibration through the dry wood and into his arm, the sound sharp against the otherwise empty stretch of land. He paused once, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve, and that was when he noticed her, standing near the edge of the yard, not close enough to interrupt, not far enough to disappear, her figure still against the open horizon. She had come out without him hearing the door, without the boards announcing her steps the way they did for him, and she watched, not idly, not with curiosity alone, but with a kind of attention that followed each movement, each swing, each shift of weight. Ethan set the hammer down on the post, not fully, just resting it there, and reached into his pocket for a nail, letting it slip once from his fingers on purpose, a small mistake, the kind that happens a dozen times a day and means nothing to anyone watching. The nail fell, striking the hard dirt with a faint tick before settling into stillness, and for a brief moment, nothing happened. Then her head turned, just slightly, not exaggerated, not searching, but precise, aligning with the spot where the nail had landed as if she had seen it fall without ever needing to look. Ethan picked it up slowly, his movements unchanged, his expression steady, but something in his mind tightened, not alarm, not yet, just a thread, pulled taut between what he had been told and what he was beginning to see. He set the nail in place and lifted the hammer again, but this time, before it struck, he let it hover for a fraction longer than necessary, then brought it down with a softer hit, not enough to drive the nail fully, just enough to make a muted sound, a sound that would not carry far, that would not demand attention, and still, she reacted, not with her body, not with a visible start, but with that same subtle shift, that quiet awareness that came too quickly, too naturally, to be nothing. The wind moved across the field, bending the tall grass in slow waves, and somewhere in the distance, a loose board on the barn tapped lightly against its frame, a rhythm irregular and faint, and Ethan saw her eyes flick once in that direction before returning to him, not questioning, not revealing, just noting. He drove the nail in the rest of the way, the sound sharper now, final, and set the hammer aside, turning toward her fully for the first time since he had started. She did not look away, did not pretend to be unaware of his attention, just stood there, steady, her posture relaxed but ready, like someone who had learned to hold herself between two worlds without belonging fully to either. Ethan took a step toward her, slow, deliberate, not closing the distance completely, just enough to change the space between them, and he lifted his hand slightly. Not a command, not a question, just a gesture, simple, open, asking without words what he had not yet decided to say. She watched him, her gaze steady, then glanced past him toward the house, toward the door, toward the place where the bell sat waiting on the table, untouched since morning, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to hold its breath. Then she looked back at him, and though her face did not change, though her expression remained as calm and unreadable as before, there was something new in her eyes, something that did not belong to silence, something that felt like it had been listening all along. And Ethan understood, not in words, not fully, but enough to know that whatever truth sat behind that quiet, it was not the one the town had sold him. And it was not going to stay hidden forever. That night came in quiet, the kind of quiet that settled over the land like a blanket pulled too tight, and the ranch held its breath the way it always did after sundown, every sound sharper, every movement carrying farther than it should. Ethan Cole sat at the small wooden table with a lantern burning low beside him, its flame steady but dim, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls like things that did not belong to daylight. He did not read, did not write, did not move much at all, just sat there listening, the way a man does when he starts to realize that silence can speak if you let it. The bell still rested where he had left it that morning, untouched, its brass surface catching the faint glow of the lantern, waiting for a purpose it had not yet been given. Down the hall, her door remained closed, no sound coming from within, no shift of floorboards, no sign of movement, and for a while, that was enough. That was what he had expected. Then something changed. It was small, almost nothing, the kind of sound a man might miss if his mind was elsewhere. A soft movement, a footstep placed carefully, not on the center of a board but along its edge where the wood would not complain. Ethan did not turn his head, did not shift in his chair, just let his eyes rest on the table while his attention moved elsewhere, tracking the rhythm of that quiet motion as it came closer down the hall. Another step, then another, each one measured, deliberate, avoiding the places that would speak too loudly. And that was when he knew for certain that this was not chance, not luck, but knowledge, practiced and precise. The doorframe cast a thin line of shadow across the floor, and her figure appeared within it, not stepping fully into the room, just standing there, watching, her presence as controlled as everything else about her. Ethan reached for the cup beside him, lifting it just enough to let the ceramic touch the table again with a soft, dull sound, not loud, not meant to startle, just enough to mark a moment. Her eyes shifted immediately, not wide, not startled, just aware, aligning with the sound before settling back on him. And he let the cup rest again, his fingers still around it, his expression unchanged. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, carrying with it the faint creak of the barn door shifting on its hinge, a sound that came and went in uneven intervals. And once more, her gaze flicked toward it before returning, as if cataloging each piece of the world around her in a way that had nothing to do with silence. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood giving a soft groan under his weight, a sound that echoed more than it should have in the stillness. And again, she responded, not with movement, not with surprise, but with that same quiet adjustment, that same awareness that had followed every sound he had tested that day. He set the cup down fully this time, the base touching the table with a clearer note, and let the silence stretch between them, not empty now, but full of something unspoken, something that no longer needed proof. She stepped into the room then, slow, unhurried, closing the distance by a few feet, her eyes never leaving his, and though she said nothing, though no word passed her lips, the truth settled in the space between them like dust after a long ride, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Ethan did not reach for the bell, did not point to it, did not demand an answer. He simply watched her, steady and calm, the way a man watches the horizon when he knows something is coming but does not yet know what shape it will take. And in that quiet, in that shared understanding, the story he had been told about her finally began to fall apart, piece by piece, without a single word needing to be spoken. The night stretched longer than it should have, the kind that made a man lose track of hours without ever closing his eyes. And Ethan Cole did not sleep much, not because he was afraid, but because something in the house had changed, and he was not the kind of man who ignored change when it stood right in front of him. By morning, the sky came in pale and slow again, but the quiet felt different now, not empty, not neutral, but aware, like the land itself was listening back. Ethan stepped out onto the porch with his coffee, the cup, warm in his hand, and leaned against the post as he looked out over the field, letting his gaze settle into the distance the way it always had, searching for nothing and everything at once. Behind him, the door opened, soft, controlled, and he did not turn. He did not need to. He already knew it was her. She stepped out onto the porch and stopped a few feet away, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to disappear, that same careful balance she carried in everything she did. The wood beneath her feet gave a faint sound, barely there, but enough, and Ethan spoke without looking at her, his voice calm, low, like he was talking to the morning itself. "You hear more than they think." The words settled into the air between them, simple, direct, without accusation, without demand. For a moment, there was nothing, just the wind moving across the dry grass, the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the fence line. And then she shifted, not away, not back, but forward, one step, closing the space just enough to answer without needing distance. He turned then, slowly, meeting her eyes fully for the first time since the night had confirmed what he already knew. And there it was, not denial, not surprise, just acknowledgement, quiet and steady, like something she had been carrying for a long time and had finally decided not to hide from him anymore. She did not speak, not yet, but her silence was no longer the same. It was not empty, it was chosen. Ethan held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, not pressing, not forcing more from her than she was ready to give, and took a step past her, heading down off the porch toward the yard, as if the matter had already been settled in the only way that mattered. But as he passed, he let his hand rest briefly on the edge of the doorframe, tapping it once with his knuckle, a small, sharp sound, and behind him, he heard it, not with his ears alone, but with the way the air shifted, the way her attention followed it instantly, naturally, without effort. He kept walking, boots crunching softly against the dirt, and called out over his shoulder, not loud, not testing anymore, just speaking as one would to another person who could hear. "There is work to do." The words were simple, but they carried something else now, something new, something closer to respect than assumption. He did not wait for an answer, did not look back, just moved toward the barn, trusting that whatever she chose to be, it would not be decided by him. A few seconds passed, then he heard it, footsteps behind him, steady, unhidden this time, not avoiding the boards, not soft enough to disappear, just honest. And that was the moment something shifted again, not in her, not in him, but in the space between them, where silence had once been a barrier and now began to feel like something else entirely, something shared, something understood. By the time they reached the barn, the sun had fully risen, and the day had begun, but for Ethan Cole, the truth had already arrived before the light did, and it stood there beside him now, walking at his pace, no longer pretending to be anything less than what it was. The day carried on like any other, the sun climbing higher, the work steady, the rhythm of the ranch settling into something that almost felt normal again. But beneath it all there was a tension that did not belong to routine, something quiet and waiting just beyond the edge of sight. By late afternoon, the air shifted, not with wind, but with distance, a faint tremor through the ground that most men would miss if they were not paying attention, a pattern too steady to be chance. Ethan Cole paused near the barn, one hand resting against the wooden frame, his eyes lifting toward the far edge of the property where the land met the sky in a long, flat line. He did not speak, did not call out, but he listened, not just with his ears, but with the instinct that had kept him alive out here longer than most. Behind him, she stopped as well, her posture changing in a way that was almost invisible, a slight stillness, a tightening of focus, her gaze already fixed on the same distant point before the sound fully arrived. Then it came, soft at first, the faint, rhythmic echo of hooves against dry ground, far enough away to be dismissed by someone who did not know better, but close enough to matter. Ethan stepped out into the open yard, the sun casting long shadows behind him, and counted the rhythm without thinking. 1, 2, 3, more than one rider, not a passing traveler, not a stray. He did not reach for a weapon, did not rush, just stood there, steady, as the sound grew clearer, carrying across the open land with nothing to slow it down. She moved then, not toward the house, not to hide, but closer to him, stopping just off to his side. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, as if the sound meant something specific to her, something she had been expecting long before it ever reached his ears. The figures appeared over the rise a few moments later, silhouettes at first, dark against the light, then clearer as they approached, 3 men on horseback, their pace controlled, not hurried, not careless, the kind of approach that said they knew exactly where they were going. They did not call out, did not announce themselves, just rode straight toward the ranch like they had business that did not require permission. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, not aggressive, not welcoming, just grounded, his presence enough to mark the boundary without needing words. The riders slowed as they reached the edge of the yard, dust settling around them in soft clouds, and one of them leaned slightly in the saddle, his voice carrying across the space, casual on the surface, but edged with something else underneath. "We are looking for a girl," he said, his tone light enough to pass as polite, but not asking a question. Ethan did not answer right away, his gaze steady, unreadable, and for a moment, the silence stretched between them, long enough to say more than any quick reply could. Beside him, she did not move, did not step back, did not hide, just stood there, listening, her attention sharp, her breathing even, as the men continued. "She does not speak," another added, a faint smile in his voice. "And she cannot hear, so if you have seen her, she would not have answered you anyway." A quiet pause followed, and then the first man spoke again, softer this time, but clearer, as if the words were meant to land somewhere specific. "But she listens," he said, almost to himself, "more than she should." Ethan felt it then, not from the men, but from beside him, the slightest shift. Not fear, not panic, but something deeper, something that confirmed what had already been unfolding since the moment he met her. He did not look at her, did not give anything away, just kept his eyes on the riders and said, calm and steady, "You are a long way from town." The men exchanged brief glances, something unspoken passing between them, and the air tightened just a little more, not with violence, but with knowledge, the kind that does not need to be explained to be understood. And in that moment, standing there between the open land and the quiet truth beside him, Ethan realized that whatever story had brought her to that auction yard had not ended there. It had only followed her here, and now it had finally arrived. The air held still after the man's words, not because the wind had stopped, but because something heavier had taken its place, something that settled between all of them without asking permission. Ethan Cole did not move, did not glance beside him, did not acknowledge the presence that stood just within his reach, because he understood now that whatever came next did not belong to him to control. The riders shifted slightly in their saddles, the leather creaking under their weight, the horses breathing slow and steady, as if even they knew this was not a moment to rush. "We have been following a trail for 2 days," the first man continued, his voice calm, almost conversational, as if he were discussing weather instead of something that had brought him miles across open land. "And it ends here." Ethan let the words sit for a moment, long enough to feel their shape, then nodded once, slow, deliberate, like a man acknowledging a fact rather than agreeing to it. "Most trails do," he said, his tone even, offering nothing more. A faint smile touched the corner of the man's mouth, not friendly, not unkind, just knowing, and his gaze shifted past Ethan, landing where it had been aiming all along. "You have been quiet long enough," he said, his voice dropping just slightly, not louder, but clearer, as if it had found its intended place. The silence that followed was different from the others that had come before. It was no longer uncertain, no longer waiting. It was full, complete, like a held breath finally reaching its end. Beside Ethan, she stepped forward, not fast, not hesitant, just one step that changed everything, her boots pressing into the dust with a sound that did not try to hide itself. Ethan did not stop her, did not reach out. He only shifted his weight slightly, enough to give her space, enough to show without words that whatever choice she made would not be taken from her. She moved past him by a single step, placing herself where she could be seen fully, where the light touched her face without shadow, and for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, She looked directly at the men without lowering her gaze, without softening it. The men watched her closely now, no longer pretending, no longer testing, just waiting, because they already knew what mattered. A second passed, then another, and then she spoke. "You took longer than I expected." Her voice was steady, clear, not loud, but carrying across the yard with a weight that silence had never been able to hold, and the sound of it settled into the space like something that had always belonged there. Ethan felt it, not as surprise, not as shock, but as confirmation, the final piece falling into place exactly where it had been leading all along. The men did not react with surprise either, only a quiet recognition, as if hearing her speak was not the revelation, only the proof. "We had to be sure," one of them replied, his tone measured, careful, and she nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging. "You heard everything," the first man said, not as a question, but as a statement that did not need an answer, and she held his gaze without hesitation. "Enough," she said, her voice calm, controlled. "Enough to know what you were planning, and enough to know I would not stay where silence was the only way to survive." The wind moved again then, light across the open field, carrying her words farther than the yard, farther than the men who stood there, and for a moment, no one spoke. Ethan stood just behind her, not in front, not between, just there, steady, present, and he did not add to her words, did not take them, did not change them, because they were hers, and that was the only thing that mattered. The riders exchanged another glance, something quieter this time, something that spoke of decisions already made, and the tension that had been building did not break. It shifted, turning from something sharp into something resolved. And in that stillness, with her voice no longer hidden and the truth no longer uncertain, the story that had followed her across miles of land finally stood in the open, not waiting to be revealed, but choosing to be heard. The wind carried her words across the yard, soft but certain, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that single space between her and the men who had come looking, as if everything else had stepped back to let the truth stand on its own. Ethan Cole did not move from where he stood, a step behind her, not shielding, not leading, just present in a way that did not ask to be seen, and the riders understood that as clearly as anything that had been said. The first man studied her for a long second, his expression no longer guarded, no longer testing, but measuring something else entirely, something closer to respect than pursuit. "You made your choice," he said quietly, and it was not a challenge, not a threat, just a recognition of something already decided. She did not look away, did not soften her stance, her voice steady when she answered. "I did." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had come before, every mile, every silence, every moment she had chosen not to speak when it would have been easier to disappear. One of the other riders shifted slightly, glancing toward Ethan, then back to her, as if recalculating something that no longer fit the story they had been following. "You understand what happens next," he said, not unkindly, but with the certainty of a man who believed the road ahead had already been drawn. She nodded once, slow, deliberate. "I do," she said, and there was no fear in it, only clarity. The silence that followed was not tense anymore, not waiting for something to break, but settling into something quieter, something resolved, like dust after a long ride finally finding its place. The first man exhaled, a small sound, almost lost to the open air, and then he reached for his reins, turning his horse slightly, not away in retreat, but in acceptance. "Then there is nothing left to take from here," he said, his gaze holding hers for a final moment before shifting back to the horizon. The others followed his lead, their movements unhurried, the horses stepping back with the same controlled pace they had arrived with, and within a few seconds, the space between them began to open again, the distance returning like it had never been broken. Ethan watched them go without comment, his posture unchanged, his presence steady until the last trace of dust settled back into the earth. Only then did he shift, his eyes moving to her, not searching, not questioning, just meeting her where she stood now, no longer hidden, no longer silent. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, just there, like something shared that did not need to be explained. She glanced toward the house, toward the open door, toward the place where the small brass bell still rested on the table, untouched since the morning it had been offered. Ethan followed her gaze, then stepped forward, slow and unforced, walking past her without brushing against her, without interrupting the space she now occupied. Inside, the house felt the same as before, but different in a way that had nothing to do with walls or furniture, and he reached for the bell, lifting it once, feeling its weight in his hand before setting it back down exactly where it had been. When he stepped outside again, she was still there, standing in the same place, her eyes on him, steady and clear. He did not hand her the bell, did not point to it, did not ask her to use it. Instead, he stepped aside, just enough to clear the doorway, just enough to leave the path open, and said nothing at all. The choice hung there, quiet and complete, not something to be given, not something to be taken, but something that had always belonged to her. She stood for a moment longer, then moved, not away from him, not past him, but through the doorway, her steps calm, certain, her voice no longer needed to prove anything. Ethan remained where he was, just outside, his gaze lifting once more to the wide stretch of land beyond the fence. And in that stillness, in that quiet that no longer needed to hide anything, the only thing left was the understanding that out here, a person was not defined by what the world believed about them, but by what they chose to reveal when it mattered most. And sometimes, the strongest thing a man could do was not to speak for someone, but to step aside and let them be heard.